I'm Rachel Muers. I'm Professor of Divinity at the University of Edinburgh, and this is a talk that's asking the question, is Christianity bad for the environment? Here's what we'll cover. I'm going to talk about 3 reasons why we might think Christianity is bad for the environment. I'm going to talk about anthropocentrism, which is the idea that humans are what's most important, or humans are at the centre of our beliefs. I'm going to talk about dualism, which is this idea that there are 2 things, matter and spirit, that's the dual, 2, and the spirit's what's important, and the matter is what isn't important. And then I'm going to talk about eschatology, which is Christian belief about the end of the world, and the idea that if the world's all coming to an end anyway, we don't need to care about the environment. Those are 3 aspects of Christian belief that we might think would make Christianity bad for the environment. But I'm going to show you why it might not be quite that simple and why there's some debates about them. And at the end, I'll give you some ideas for where to look if you want to study Christian responses to the environmental emergency. First, I'm going to tell you a little bit about why anybody started to think that Christianity specifically might be a problem for the environment. The key person here is a scholar called Lynn White, who wrote a major article in 1967 called The Historic Roots of Our Ecologic Crisis. And if you ever study anything about Christianity and the environment, you will probably find people talking about Lynn White. He said that these 3 aspects of Christian theology, which I showed you on the last slide, anthropocentrism, dualism, and an otherworldly eschatology, a belief that the future world, a world beyond this world, was what really mattered, had fed into social thought and people's practices and behaviours towards the natural world. And that in countries where most people were Christians, he thought particularly in the West, in North America and Western Europe, these Christian beliefs had been very influential and had shaped people's behaviour and attitudes to the environment, and that in turn had led to some of the environmental problems that we're facing today. So he wasn't saying Christianity was teaching people to damage the environment, but he was saying these background Christian beliefs were influencing the way that people thought about non-human nature and the non-human environment, and that was making them behave in ways that were damaging the environment. Basically, he thought Christianity was teaching people not to care enough about the environment. So let's have a look at these 3 aspects of Christian belief that Lynn White identified. We'll start with anthropocentrism. So you remember, this is the idea that human beings are the thing that really matters, maybe the only thing that matters, or maybe the thing that matters most. So within Christianity, and indeed also within Judaism, there's this very strong central belief right there in the narratives of creation, the stories about creation in Genesis, that the human being is made in the image of God. And that's something that's said about human beings and not about any other animals. And then, if you think through the Christian story, at the real heart of the Christian story, you have God coming to earth, God made incarnate, as we say, made flesh, in a human being, so that we can look at a human being and in a certain sense see God. So think about both of those as ways in which Christianity places human beings at the very centre of the story about God and the world. And we might think that both of those would make people think that human beings are the most important sort of animal, maybe the only important sort of animal, maybe that everything in the natural world is sort of arranged around and in the service of human beings because they're the ones that matter. And hopefully you can see why thinking that human beings are what really matter might make us rather careless about the natural environment. Okay, so what do we think about anthropocentrism as a reason Christianity is bad for the environment? Well, Some people would say that Christianity isn't really that anthropocentric after all, because what's really at the centre of Christianity is not the human being, but God. And those same Genesis narratives that make humans in the image of God put humans alongside all the many other things that God creates, all set out together and all being looked at by God, and God saying that they're all good. It puts human beings in the middle of all the other creatures. And the other thing that we might want to ask ourselves is, well, maybe human beings are important in Christianity, but that doesn't mean that you're necessarily going to stop caring for the environment. It might make you care more, because it might make you think, well, human beings are special. That means they have a special job to look after the rest of creation, to exercise what we call stewardship, to have a responsibility before God and given by God to care for the natural world. The other thing you might think is, well, we're human. So in a certain sense, when we think about the story of God and the world, we're going to put ourselves at the centre because that's just where we naturally are. But it doesn't mean that we have to behave in ways that damage the environment. Let's move on and let's think a bit about dualism. Now, you remember that's this dualism. Dual is two, and this is this idea that when Christianity looks at everything there is, it thinks about it in terms of there are spiritual things and there are material things. And the spiritual things are the things that matter, and the material things are the things that don't. So people who want to say Christianity is dualistic might talk about the soul, the belief that human beings have an immortal soul. And the idea, well, maybe that makes you value the soul more than the body, and the spiritual things more than the material things. And there are a lot of texts in the Christian scriptures which sound as though they're saying that the spirit is what matters and the flesh or the material world is not. Now, this is actually a bit more controversial. Let's see why. Well, actually, when you look at Christian beliefs, even about the human being, and what happens to the human being after death, it's not just a belief that the soul goes to heaven. There's a belief that the body is resurrected. Jesus is resurrected, but that's as a promise of everybody's bodies being resurrected. So that seems to think that bodies really matter. You can't be yourself without your body. And again, as I said earlier, there's this idea that everything, matter and spirit, is created by God. If you like, that's the difference that really matters is between God and everything else, not between any of the particular things and each other. The difference that makes a difference is God and everything else. And God equally creates the material things and the spiritual things. And then back to this point I mentioned earlier, that at the centre of the Christian story, you have God becoming flesh. Not a soul, not a spirit, not a floaty around thing, but an embodied human being. So those might be reasons we think Christianity is not that dualistic after all. But the other thing that we might want to think about is, well, even if we think that there are spiritual realities as well as material realities, that doesn't mean we don't care for and need the material realities. So maybe the dualism, it's not all over the place in Christianity, and even if it is present in Christianity, it might not be making a huge difference. Last thing, eschatology. That is the last thing, because if you remember, eschatology means Christian beliefs about the end of the world. And so why might eschatology be bad for the environment? Well, have a look at this quotation from the Bible that I've put here from 1 Corinthians. For the present form of this world is passing away. And you'll find quite a lot of text like that, particularly in the New Testament, from these early Christians who really believed that there was about to be a decisive transformation of the world such that you wouldn't recognise any of it anymore, that the end of the world really was coming. And so if you think about that in relation to the environment, the problem might be, well, if you think that this world's about to end anyway, why would you bother looking after it? You've got a quotation on this slide from a guy called James G. Watt, who was a Secretary of the Interior in the USA a long time ago, in the 1980s. And when he was being asked about policies on the environment, his government's policies on the environment, and particularly they asked him, well, how are you going to make sure we safeguard nature for future generations? And he said, I don't know how many future generations we can count on before the Lord returns. So that sounds as though, you see somebody who's obviously a devout Christian of a certain kind, it sounds as though he's thinking, well, maybe there's not much point planning for and looking after the distant future, because we expect quite soon. So the Lord returning, that's a reference to Jesus' second coming and the end of history. So that's him saying, things are going to change dramatically and the world's going to end anyway, so I'm not sure how much we need to care about this. To be fair to this guy, James, what he did go on to say, but I think we should look after the world anyway. So that might already bring you to the idea that maybe this isn't quite so simple either. Let's have a look at that. One thing to say is that Christian belief in the end of the world, in a decisive end of history that God brings about, doesn't always mean that all of the stuff that we've got now, the world as we know it, completely disappears. A lot of Christian visions of the end of the world are actually about restoration and healing that includes the material world as we have it. So you've got on this slide a very nice picture of Edward Hicks' paintings of the peaceable kingdom, and he's painting a picture of the prophecy in Isaiah of the time when the whole world will be reconciled to God and filled with the knowledge of God. And it includes this image of all of the animals having peaceable relations with each other, the lion lying down with the lamb and all this kind of thing. You might think that's quite kind of fairy tale fantasy. The point I'm trying to make is that the material world as we know it, wild creatures and domestic creatures and their environments are included in Christian visions of the end of the world. They're not cut off by them. The other thing that we need to believe is, that we need to remember is that, Christian beliefs that the end of the world is approaching hasn't usually stopped Christians taking action for a better world. Even in the times of the New Testament churches, these people who were saying the present form of this world is passing away were still believing that they needed to act in ways that took care of each other, that took care of the society around them. It hasn't stopped Christians caring about this world. And in fact, I wonder if, at the time we're now in, facing real fears for a catastrophic change in the world, the environmental emergency, whether there might be resources in Christian tradition about the end of the world for helping people think about anxiety about the future, helping people deal with the idea that the world as we know it might not last forever, helping people deal with the idea that there's a future that we don't control, because those are all ideas that are really built into Christian thinking about the end of the world. I hope you found some of these thoughts useful or interesting. If you want to find out more about how Christians of various denominations and groups are involved in environmental action and how they are asking and answering these questions, two things I'd recommend is to have a look at Laudato Si, the encyclical by Pope Francis, and its official website, and to follow up on the thinking and action of groups, Christian groups aimed at climate action. Thanks for listening, and I hope you enjoy your studies of Christianity and the environment.